Only a virgin could create that type of power.
Welcome to Decoding TV's coverage of the Acolyte episode 7. Choice is the name of the episode. I'm David Chen here with Patrick Klepek. Before we dive into episode 7, I wanted to mention something real quick from episode 6 of the Acolyte. Last week we covered the episode with Dan Gvozden, and he had made the connect. We were texting about the episode after the fact, and he had made the connection. You know, we see a lot of Chimere's scars on his back when he disrobed in the last episode of the Acolyte, and then we also see that there is Master Venestra, the Jedi, has a lightsaber whip, and we never explicitly made the connection that maybe the scars came from the whip, you know, here on the podcast. But I wanted to say very possible, like maybe there's some backstory there with Chimera and Venestra that we don't know about. Also, by the way, last week, my understanding, like this came out, this was revealed after the episode came out, but it's the first time that somebody has fully exposed their genitalia to another character in Star Wars ever, as far as I can tell. Like, is
breaking ground.
Yeah, I know this is a groundbreaking show for sure. Patrick Klepek, did you like the lightsaber whip? What was your reaction to that one?
Yeah, it was cool. I don't know that we wanted to see more of it. It was, but I actually kind of respected the restraint of just like, oh, here's a cool idea. Why is that there? The lightsabers could do that? What? Don't worry about it too much. It's a whip.
I'm really curious if we're going to see lightsaber whip in the one remaining episode of the show that we have left. But
it would seem odd to introduce that and not do.
I agree.
Something with it.
That is weird. That would be weird. Then again, Patrick, the show has done some weird things.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. Let's talk about episode 7. This entire episode is a flashback. And it essentially tells the events of episode 3, but from the perspective of the Jedi. So the literally the exact same events from a different perspective. Patrick Klepek, what'd you think?
Just rubbing my temples, David. This show, all told, is, I think, a bunch of really great ideas executed poorly. I love so much of the Acolyte on paper. And then in watching it unravel, the way it's been constructed, I find it to be so much less interesting and deeply frustrating. I thought this episode was like really emblematic of a lot of the problems in the storytelling in the Acolyte. I think it's a huge disservice to any of the mysteries set up, to Soul as a character. Motivations don't make sense or land for me. I found it to be a complete mess that would have been less of a mess if it was answered much earlier in the show, but I found myself pretty exhausted and kind of ready for the end of this show by the time I felt very David Chen by the end of this episode.
Wow.
Is what I'm trying to say.
I love that I've become synonymous with cantankerous unpleasantness. Yeah, it's starting to become clear to me that the show is bad, and that's always a shame. Like I think last episode, very little happened.
Yeah.
And it's clearly building up to a big reveal of what the truth is behind everything, right? And so it's like, oh, maybe if the truth is super interesting,
or surprising, or different
surprising,
than anything
that
you
will
might have expected.
That will redeem everything that we have seen so far, right? And this episode, we did get the reveal, and I just have to say, I was very underwhelmed by what the reveal was of what's going on, and we will talk about exactly what happened this episode. I do also want to point out that our video editor John made a great supercut of all the times that Saul in this show said, "I need to tell you exactly what happened 16 years ago on Brendok," and then has been interrupted from doing so. That is available at youtube.com/@decodingtv, and you should watch that because it's a great summary of how this show has parceled out information. Now, I will say, actually, before we commence, some of the action in this episode, as usual, is awesome. Like, you know, we are now into spoiler territory for episode 7 of the Acolyte, but there is a Wookiee Jedi lightsaber fight, and it is great. Like, it is. It's not just like, oh, it's a Jedi. It's like a lightsaber fight with a slightly bigger character. It's like, it is substantively different enough from other lightsaber scenes that it's like, okay, that is very, very cool. And so that's the conundrum of the show, is you cannot just dismiss it outright. Like, there's still some cool stuff in it. There's a we'll talk about it, but my point being that there are still some cool elements that occur in this episode, right? Like, it's not like a complete total waste. It's just
that's a huge, like, the show takes some really big narrative and character and even mythological swings and like attempts to subvert our expectations of how views of things like this. Like, again, it's one of those things where on paper, it's why I was so excited about the show when like it was announced, where it was set, what they were like the kind of, you know, murder mystery. I was like, oh, all this stuff, even as the show has doled itself out, like there's a lot of cool stuff it's doing. Like, on paper, I just don't like how any of it's been, not any of it. I'm a lot of this is my exasperation at this particular episode, sort of like bubbling. I think a lot of holding out, like, okay, as part of a mystery show, like maybe some pieces are going to lock into place that don't make how it's felt getting to this point better, but at least like, oh, it was worth getting here.
Yeah.
And so far, it hasn't felt like it's achieved that. And it makes the entire experience of having watched it in retrospect just kind of like, it's a missed opportunity. Like, there are bad shows that you're like, well, I don't know if this was a great idea to start with. Like, I don't know what you were going to do with this. Not sure what you were going to salvage out of this whole endeavor. And here, it just feels like a whiff. It feels like a missed opportunity to have done something really interesting.
Yes.
And the way it was arranged did not arrive at the interesting part.
Well, let's start by talking about what this episode is, which is a flashback episode to Brendok 16 years earlier. Now, I just want to start with this component of it, Patrick Klepek, because this episode is presented as a flashback. Like, the very last episode is Saul saying, and finally, I'm going to tell you everything, right? And then presumably, we don't know, but presumably this episode is what he tells May, right? Now, why do I think it was a mistake to present the episode in this way? There is, Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, one of the greatest movies of all time. Like, the idea is like people tell different versions of, like, people recall events differently, right? The problem is that's not what's happening in these flashback episodes, right? It's just they're literally just presenting it from like a different perspective in those things, and we're not even clear what Saul is saying or not saying during this, right? Like, there's parts of this episode that Saul is not even present for.
Yes. Like, when like the fire happens, like he's not there for that.
Like, how does he know that happened? Like, there's all this stuff that he doesn't know that happened with the Coven, and the reason I think that's a problem is because it's missing an opportunity to use this flashback stuff to actually build character. Like, how Saul would present this information is far more interesting than just seeing it from a different perspective, in my opinion. Right?
Because the way it's presented makes Saul look like a huge dumbass. And like the entire episode's framing is just like, wow, like you're awful at your job and made like mistake after mistake after mistake. And it's to your point. Maybe this appears in the last episode, but that's something we've been doing continually through this show is like, well, maybe in the next episode we'll get, like this missing component.
In the final episode, you mean when you say last
the final episode, right? Yes. Yeah. And Saul's response to how he is presented in this episode, if he views himself as being a giant dumbass throughout this experience, like, that's worth knowing, and it would be worth knowing right now. Not as a cliffhanger for the next episode. Like, right. I would have loved a framing of this that was actually Soul telling
the voiceover narration of like, I am baffled why they didn't do that. Like, maybe it'll become clear why they didn't do that next episode. But like,
running out of times to say maybe it'll become clear, which is our version of Soul saying.
I'm going to tell you what happened, right? Yeah, but it's like I don't, and here's other issues that introduce. So that's like a missed opportunity. But other issues is we end up seeing similar events, or we end up basically reliving events that we are already deeply familiar with. Like,
yes,
like so much time is wasted just like showing stuff that we already saw from episode 3. One of the things that I really appreciate about any TV show is like when a character learns some information and then needs to convey that information to other characters, how do they handle it? Like, how does the show handle it? Because if they just repeat the information, That's very uninteresting because the audience already knows that. So like I've seen many ways of shows handling this. I was just watching Dark Matter, which I'm really enjoying so far, by the way. And there's a moment when like one character needs to explain a whole bunch of information to another character that we already know.
I have this exposition dump. What do I do with it?
Right, and the way they handle it is cut to he's already explained it, and then the person's asking follow-up questions.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
And it's just like, oh, that's awesome. That's a great way of now we know that they both know the information, and like it kind of like there's some character development going on here. Whereas the way they've handled it here is it is baffling to me, like why they did it this way. Of just like, okay, we're going to show you the whole sequence, I guess from Osha's memory, and then we're going to show you the whole sequence again from Soul's memory, but we're not going to make it explicit that that's exactly what's going on, right? So it's like, and by the way, it doesn't really even freaking make sense if that's what's going on, because there's so many scenes that take place where Soul's not there. So how did he learn that information? Like, how did he know about Corbin's mind journey?
It feels
did Corbin,
as though
like tell him about the mind journey later. Like what, like
it feels like one episode was shot and then just cut up into two. Like it's very easy to imagine this all being a cohesive narrative whole about what happened 16 years ago from everybody's perspectives. And then that makes sense. Like that makes narrative, cohesive, contextual sense. But here you introduce once again a sense of unreliable narration. And that's not like my sense of disbelief at this point is off. Like I'm done. Like I need you just to tell me what's happening.
You don't even fully trust what we're seeing in this episode is what you're saying, right?
I don't like how like when if I'm supposed to presume Soul is telling this, why should I buy that that's what happened with the fire? Right. There's nothing to tell me that that's true.
There's going to be another Prestige moment at the end of next episode where we find out that this episode
maybe
was false
I wouldn't put it past the show at this point.
All right. So that's just kind of we haven't got to what happens this episode, but that's just like the premise, right? So anyway, the Jedi are taking readings from the soil, like the 4 Jedi. It's a Brendok 16 years ago. We find out they've been there for 7 weeks. Master Indara, aka Carrie-Anne Moss, who by the way is great in this episode.
She is,
I think she's awesome. It's great that we get to see Carrie-Anne Moss again. She says something really weird in this episode. I wrote down the exact quote. She says, 100 years ago, this planet was cataloged as lifeless because of a hyperspace disaster. Yet this planet, Brendok, is thriving, end quote. That is the exact quote. Very weird quote. It sounds like the first half of the statement was ADR'd. Like they re-recorded it. But it's like, it felt like there was something else that she said of like, 100 years ago, this star system was lifeless. Maybe that's what it was, but then one of the keepers of the Star Wars mythos was like, actually, that's not true. There was life in the star system, so you have to change it to planet. And then later, when she says, yet this planet, Brendok, is thriving, then that makes absolutely no sense. So right out the gate, I'm like, okay, there's some issues here with like the storytelling this episode. Anyway, the Jedi are looking for a vergence, a concentration of force energy. It's the only thing that might explain where all this life is coming from. So then we see the events of this flashback, from Soul's perspective. Soul is basically kind of like a peeping Tom. He sees like Osha and May hanging out in the forest. May's torturing animals, and he follows them back to their hideout. And at that point, we see some free soloing up the mountain. Free soloing.
Just say it a couple more times for the editor.
And then we kind of see the events of episode 3 from Saul's perspective, which I have to say was kind of comical, maybe potentially intentionally so, because it's literally like the same shots or the same moments, I should say, but from a different angle, and we see like Saul with his little cloak and head silhouette, in the distance. We just Saul was observing all that stuff. That's how he's presumably telling the story later. The Jedi confront the witches, and then we see Torben's mind taken over, but from his perspective. By the way, Torben's one characteristic is that he misses home. He really wants to go back to Coruscant.
Oh my god! That's not a character. That's not a motivation.
Patrick, don't you miss home when you're away? Like, when you're away on a mission for 7 weeks? Aren't you like, hey, I wish I could go back home? Like, it's a very understandable thing.
Hang the entire episode on like this character we haven't developed this at all. Like, why does he miss home? What's at home? Like 7 weeks is long, but it's not that long. You're a Jedi. Anyway.
Okay, so I have to say this scene where Mother Aniseya takes over Torben's mind is super cool. Like,
it's great. Yeah.
The way she's speaking so like seductively, and you hear her basically repeat the same lines over and over, but from different intonations. It's cool. It's cool, man. It's a cool, haunting scene. So I like the sequence. I mean, yes, character-wise, Torben, we don't really find out enough about Torben to make this really meaningful, but in terms of execution, it's very cool.
Well, it goes to underscore like the reason I found the original flashback, the original like spending time with this Coven interesting. I find their whole deal interesting, right. And I like, so even though this episode doesn't work for me, like it's fascinating, and we get a couple instances of this throughout the episode, like demonstration of like different use of powers and like what is their relationship to yada yada, like all that stuff's great. And I, in many ways, sort of at this point, wish the show was a show about the Coven as about like it was, you know, as opposed to, you know, what we've gotten with the Jedi.
It was Aniseya all along.
Yeah, I thought about that, and then I said it down.
Aniseya all along is the show.
Joke was in my head, and I set it down, and I'm glad you picked it up, David.
Yes, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right. So anyway, the Jedi figure out that May has a marking on her, which designates her to lead the Coven, and they're basically trying to put together everything they know about the witches in a very short period of time. One big new piece of information we learn is that the Jedi, like Indara, Carrie-Anne Moss's character, goes back and asks the Jedi Council, hey, can we pick up these children from this Coven and get them tested for Padawan status? And the Jedi Council says no. They turn it down.
Reasonable.
They will not sanction bringing them home. And in fact, they're like, you've already interfered too much. GTFO. But Sol is like a dog with a bone. He will not stop. And right after this, we learn from Corbin that the two girls' symbionts are the same, meaning that they're not twins. They're actually identical people, which, by the way, I just want to say is like extremely bizarre that they're doing this, given that they hired non-identical twin actors to play these girls. I just putting that out there that was very weird to me watching the show. But Ryan Britt over at Inverse wrote this about this topic. Quote, this is some nitty-gritty midichlorian action here, but the idea is that the microorganisms that Qui-Gon Jinn described in The Phantom Menace, the ones that allow everyone to communicate with the Force, have become somehow cloned, indicating that May and Osha share the same Force spirit on a microscopic level, end quote. So for those who are curious, like what that's about, there's an explanation for you. This sets Corbin off. He's like, oh, well, this proves that there's a virgins, and if I can get these girls, I can prove that there's a virgins, and we can go home. We can accomplish the mission and go home. So he hops on a speeder and takes off. Meanwhile, at the Coven, Coral tells May to use her Force powers to bring Osha back. So there's a big confrontation that's about to occur, and Sol and Corbin confront Aniseya and Coral, and then something weird happens, right? Like May shows up, and Mother Aniseya starts to kind of transform into mist, right? And I have to say, the way the show depicts it is it's not clear what's going on. Like, I think she's trying to defend May in that situation, but it's not clear. Whatever the case, Sol is threatened by this and takes a lightsaber and kills Mother Aniseya. Patrick, what was your reaction? Like, I thought this was just like not a particularly clear moment of what was actually going on here.
I was okay with the lack of clarity because I think part of, I disagree with everything Sol does in this episode. Not necessarily, not even necessarily from like a I think this is the wrong choice, but like
right.
The motivations don't make the motivations don't make sense. Like we haven't. Why does he give a shit about this kid? Like none of that is established.
He feels a connection with her. Patrick.
Well, why? Like you can't just say that. You can't just say things and then that be just like I miss home. Thus, I'm gonna like
right.
I like kid come like it's the episode over and over just states a reason for doing things without giving a justification for it, and so that's why I think it betrays Sol as a character because I don't think it actually gives him proper motivation for like did he lose a kid? Like what? Give me like literally anything to grasp onto here, but. in this specific instance, if I isolate it from my problems with the rest of the episode, I sort of like the fact that like part of what's scary about the Coven is like, we don't know what they're capable of. We don't know how their powers manifest. We don't actually know what she's doing here. And so his reaction to just sort of like, ugh, like just like thrust forward and kill her, I think is a pretty natural react. Like it's maybe the only thing that I'll defend Soul on in this episode is like, yeah, that looked pretty scary, bro. Like I get like maybe accidentally make, and if you think about it, a layer back, like if this, a part of what the show was trying to do is like, Jedi are pretty shitty cops. Like you can see like an analog like here of like, look, they rushed into a situation they're not prepared for. Something happens unexpected, and then he does something rash as a result of that and makes things so much worse. And so like if we continue that metaphor as like Jedi as space cops, you can see a lot in this scene that I think is pretty interesting. But like in the moment of what she does, it looks spooky. And like and I think that's sort of what they're getting across there is that like Soul doesn't know what he's looking at. And if he hadn't come here, if he followed the council's advice, you know, none of this would have happened. And so he has this impulsive reaction in an episode where he is impulsive throughout, and it continues to have stacked ramifications.
Fair. A vigorous defense of this enigmatic moment from the episode, Patrick Klepek. Nicely done. So anyway, he kills Aniseya, which is like a very shocking thing. And while she's trying to protect May, there was one line in the episode that I thought was really cool, where I think one of the witches says, "Someday those noble intentions you have will destroy everyone, every Jedi."
Yeah, that was good.
Like every Jedi, and it's like, oh, like it's a foreshadowing of how the Jedi essentially become extinct over time, right? But anyway, Coral attacks Soul, but Soul refuses to fight her, and right around then, the base starts blowing up because the part about May lighting the fire, that was actually true, apparently. Like, one of the big unexplained things from episode 3 was this entire base is made out of rock, right? Yes, there's some electronics and stuff, but like a lot of it's made out of rock. So May lighting the fire, that doesn't really make much sense. And so I was thinking, oh, well, they're going to explain that. They're going to have some other explanation for how the base blew up. Now, maybe episode 8 is going to have some explanation for how the base blew up.
Okay, start making the super cut.
But yeah, it turns out, yeah, May just lit a fire and everything blew up, you know? So, okay. Fair. Pretty disappointing that that's true, but fair. Anyway, what happens then is Coral, my understanding of what's going on is Coral and the entire Coven take over Kelnaka's mind. That's the Wookiee Jedi, and use Kelnaka to fight both Soul and Corbin,
which is sick. That's like such a cool idea. Like the way they're sort of swaying back and forth in unison. Like good stuff.
But the fight scene is incredible too. Like you really get a sense of like, oh man, this, I don't even know how they achieved it, but it's like you really get a sense that, hey, you do not want to fight a Wookiee Jedi, right? Like the amount of
Jedis
force,
were banned. OP. Like can't do it anymore.
The amount of force that is used is so high. Like every single one of his blows is like so incredible, and he's like breaking parts of the environment around them as he's swinging his fists and his feet and his hands. This show promised Wookiee Jedi, and in this episode, it finally delivered on that promise. And I have to say, I appreciate that at the very least, right? There's that moment when he's like putting Corbin's face up to the wall, and Corbin's like dead to rights, and then Soul intervenes at the last second and barely saves his life. And you see how Corbin's face got all messed up as a result of this whole situation too. So, but then Master Indara comes in at the last minute and saves Kelnaka using her force powers, seemingly kills the entire Coven using force powers. That's my understanding of what happened here. Patrick, does that match with what you thought?
Yeah, that's it.
Which is
like
pretty messed up if you think about it. Yeah, not loving that. And then lies about it. So basically, this law enforcement arm of the Republic comes in. They murder these unarmed people, and then they lie about it afterwards. So
because you can't put it through more Trump now.
Oh yeah,
I mean, like these people being brought to justice and like the Coven getting any sense of like, which I guess she's all that represents. Like, are there more of them? Like, are they, like we don't know, but like the idea that like, hey, the right thing to do here is to spare her from anything more, as opposed to any consequences for us is rich. But I think that's some of the strongest stuff.
Yeah,
in the episode.
Agreed. And basically, you go from kind of, oh wow, May is brutally murdering these Jedi for bad reasons to hashtag May was right. You know, like I'm rooting for May. I'm sad May didn't succeed already.
Hashtag finish the job.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that is a cool part. You know, as an idea, it's a very cool part of the episode. We've discussed why the executional.
I like that more. I just wish like Soul's incompetence and motivations along the way are not like I didn't buy. Like missing home, I didn't buy. So it's like, again, it's part and parcel with.
Right.
I love the ideas. Like I like the idea of like the Jedi. You know, even if this wasn't like they committed a like purposely, they didn't like sweep in to commit a genocide. It's basically they swept in with poor intentions to try and correct something, made it much worse, and then when it was bad, they swept it under the like. That's bad in its own way, and I can buy that, and that can be interesting. I hate how we arrived there. It just didn't work for me on that level, and it's too bad.
I mean, there are other big issues here, Patrick Klepek. Like, first of all, it is extremely like having seen all this, I just can't imagine that this is what the original vision for how this would play out would be. Like for what this reveal would be. Because here's one big thing. Theoretically, like I don't know, but theoretically, Soul is telling this information to May. Right? That's what we assume. Well, May already freaking knows most of this stuff. Like May already saw Soul kill Mother Aniseya in this flashback.
Right.
So why does Soul need to tell her that then? Like May already saw that happen. So like the person who really needs to know this is Osha, but she's not listening to this or she's not hearing this.
Right.
So it's bizarre that that's how this reveal plays out. Maybe there's another version of this where Soul was telling Osha. Whatever the case, there is a lot of unresolved stuff that next episode needs to tie up.
Yep.
And I don't have confidence that they'll be able to do it all in 45 minutes. Like, who Chimere is, like Chimere and Osha, like what? I don't even know how they're going to deal with all this stuff. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, where does the show even go from here?
It's unclear to me even like what usually at this
what
point,
are the stakes of this?
Right, you have a sense of like characters heading to a place, a primary conflict to be resolved.
Right.
Like this. Well, my
they're
worry
literally
is
heading in opposite directions right now. Like
this increasingly feels like this was a show that was sort of pitched as like you don't have to have watched Star Wars. We're telling a story, and now it feels like we're headed towards a cliffhanger that's setting up an Acolyte season 2. Like that's one of my big worries here is that. And maybe that helps explain some of the weirdness in the editing. I have no idea, but I'm increasingly of the mind that this is no longer a show that is going to like cleanly finish up in the next episode.
Mm-hmm.
There is going to be dangling threads that perhaps they go on to address in a second season. And I'm not even necessarily against a continuation of the character to this world, but I'm with you. It is very hard to imagine a satisfying conclusion to the story threads that have been set up here.
I will say, to its credit, one thing I think the show does do a good job of illustrating is the idea of the Jedi and the Sith are just two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Like, the Jedi they freaking suck in this episode, right? They just come in, they mess with everything. They literally, like, exterminate, seemingly, this entire coven of witches for basically no reason, you know? And that is really upsetting. So, like, credit to where credit's due. Like, yeah, the Jedi and the Sith. You think of the Jedi as good, the Sith as evil. No, they're just two different ways of like perceiving the same ideas. And I think the show does do a good job of illustrating that. But
Agreed.
when it comes to the characters, and structurally, how some of this has been told, it is very, very bizarre. And I am not at all clear that they're going to be able to pay this off satisfyingly by the end. So, any other thoughts, Patrick Klepek?
No, I'd say I'm rooting for the show, but I don't know what I'm rooting for. I'm rooting for the show, but I'm rooting for myself, David. I want that last episode to be good.
Same, man. Same. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.